My husband laughed in my face at the Banff Springs Hotel ballroom, calling me just a stay-at-home wife in front of every oil executive in Calgary. 14 minutes later, his entire energy brokerage went dark because he had no idea I was the silent chairwoman of the consortium that held every single one of his pipeline contracts. Just a stay-at-home wife. The words landed in the ballroom like ice cubes dropped into a crystal decanter, echoing off the vaulted ceilings while a string quartet played something that sounded suspiciously like pity. My husband, Dean Whitlock, stood with his glass of Glenfiddich raised high, his cheeks already flushed from his third pour, and he said it again, louder this time, as if the first delivery hadn't earned him enough laughter from the table. Gentlemen, this is my Margaret. 20 years of marriage and she still gets nervous around real numbers. Best hostess in Mount Royal, though. Makes a roast that would bring tears to your eyes. I smiled. I smoothed the fabric of my midnight navy gown across my lap and I smiled the way I had trained myself to smile at every Calgary Stampede breakfast, every Chamber of Commerce gala, every charity auction at the Glenbow. A smile that reached nowhere near my eyes, a smile that had become a second skin stitched together over 2 decades of being introduced as Dean's wife, Dean's charming little wife, Dean's better half who doesn't trouble herself with the business. Around our table sat 7 men whose companies depended entirely on decisions I made every Tuesday morning in a glass-walled boardroom on the 43rd floor of Bankers Hall. They didn't know I made those decisions. Some of them suspected. 2 of them knew. And one of them, Harold Cheng of Meridian Pipeline Services, was quietly texting under the table to confirm what both of us already understood. My husband had just sealed his own coffin, and he was using the nails to toast himself. Tell them, sweetheart, Dean said, patting my hand the way one might pat a golden retriever that had learned a new trick. Tell them about the time you tried to read my quarterly report. He looked at the table conspiratorially. She thought EBITDA was a vitamin. The men laughed. Most of them didn't want to. I watched the discomfort ripple around the circle of mahogany and crystal. Harold's jaw tightened. David Fortier, whose family owned half the midstream infrastructure between Fort McMurray and Hardisty, looked down at his plate. Only one man, a hedge fund director from Toronto named Patrick Ose, laughed with any genuine enthusiasm, and even he looked embarrassed about it a moment later. I lifted my water glass, took a measured sip, placed it back on the linen. Every gesture deliberate, rehearsed over years of boardroom standoffs where a single tell could cost $80 million. Actually, Dean, I said, my voice soft but clear, I thought the Q3 numbers on your eastern corridor were a bit concerning. The hedging strategy on the Alberta differential seemed aggressive given where WTI is heading. For one perfect second, the table went silent. Harold's eyes flicked up to meet mine, something like wonder in them. David's fork paused midair. Then Dean burst into laughter so loud that a waiter 2 tables over jumped. Oh my God. He wiped his eye theatrically. Did you hear that? She's been reading the business section again. I keep telling her, Mags, stick to Canadian living. You were so much happier when we were picking out drapes for the Canmore place. A waiter approached with another round of Glenfiddich. Dean accepted his eagerly, the ice in the glass rattling against his teeth as he drank. I watched his hand tremble on the rim. I knew that tremor. 20 years of marriage had taught me to read it the way a farmer reads the sky before a hailstorm. He was halfway into the whiskey-fueled monologue he always gave when he wanted to feel like the biggest man in the room. I had watched this performance 100 times. I had hosted dinners for it. Written thank you notes for it. Picked him up off the floor of his own study after it. But tonight was different. Tonight, in the ballroom of the Banff Springs, with the mountains looming blue and indifferent outside the arched windows, was going to be the last performance. The difference between a real man and a pretender, Dean declared, raising his glass now to the entire table, is knowing what your wife is for. My Margaret, bless her heart, she's for the home, she's for the dinners. She's for making me look good at Stampede breakfasts. He turned to me with what he likely believed was an affectionate smile. She knows her role. That's why we've lasted 20 years when half the guys at this table are on wife number 2. Patricia Moreau, who sat across from me, with her husband the oil sands executive, set her wine glass down hard enough to make the stemware sing. Patricia had been my mentor when I first started building the Lakeshore Holdings portfolio back in 2004, before I'd learned to hide the whole thing behind Dean's oblivious back. She caught my eye. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. The timing had to be exact. My phone vibrated against my thigh. Without looking, I knew what it would say. The consortium board had convened in an emergency session 3 hours ago in the private lounge at the Ranchman's Club. The paperwork was drafted. The press release was embargoed until 9 a.m. Mountain Time tomorrow. Every one of Dean Whitlock's contracts, with Meridian, with Northern Cascade Resources, with the entire Cheng Fortier midstream network, was going to evaporate before his morning coffee. You see, Dean continued, warming to his theme the way he always did when the whiskey hit his bloodstream, a man in oil and gas, he needs a wife who understands her place. He doesn't need some Bay Street princess telling him about hedging. He needs someone at home. Someone who understands that the oil patch is no place for a woman. Harold, you know what I'm talking about, right? You're Linda, she keeps the house running while you run the pipeline. Harold Cheng, whose wife Linda had a PhD in petroleum engineering from the University of Alberta and ran the technical advisory board for 3 major First Nations consultation projects, smiled very thinly. Sure, Dean. Sure. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. Anger had burned itself out years ago, somewhere around the 3rd anniversary party where Dean had told my own mother that I was lucky he'd married me because nobody else would have put up with my opinions. What I felt now was the cold, patient satisfaction of a hunter who has been tracking a deer for 20 years and has finally, at long last, cornered it against a cliff. I excused myself quietly. Dean didn't notice. He was already launching into a new monologue about how his firm was going to own the Trans Mountain expansion contracts by the end of the fiscal year. He had no idea those contracts had been signed 3 weeks ago. They had been signed by me. In the powder room off the main lobby, with its wallpaper depicting Rocky Mountain wildflowers and its brass fixtures polished to a mirror shine, I stood at the marble sink and looked at myself. 42 years old. 2 children in university, one at McGill and one at UBC. A husband who had spent the last decade of our marriage convinced that I was a decorative ornament, and yet, I pulled out my phone. 3 messages from my chief operating officer. 2 from legal. 1 from Harold, sent just minutes ago. Your signal. We're ready when you are. I wanted to feel triumphant. I wanted to feel vindicated. What I felt instead was a strange, aching tenderness for the woman I had been 20 years ago, sitting across from Dean Whitlock on our first date at Il Sogno in Bridgeland, my hands folded in my lap while he asked me what I wanted to do with my life. I had told him, honestly, that I wanted to build an investment firm. That I wanted to be the first woman on the board of an Alberta-based energy conglomerate. That my grandfather had worked the derricks in Leduc and my grandmother had kept the books for 3 refineries and I had their stubbornness in my bones. Dean had laughed. He had laughed kindly then, not meanly, but the seed was planted. He had said, "Oh, Maggie, sweetheart, you just need to meet the right guy, and those dreams will feel a lot smaller." By our 3rd date, he was already talking about the house in Mount Royal, the chalet in Canmore, the trips to Whistler every March. By our engagement, he was introducing me to his colleagues as his future wife, full stop, no profession, no history, no future of my own. And I, at 22 years old, had made a choice. I had chosen to let him believe it. I had chosen to keep building what my grandfather had called the quiet fortune, the kind that doesn't put your name on buildings, the kind that grows in silence while louder men announce themselves from rooftops. I had filed my incorporation papers under my grandmother's maiden name, Lakeshore. And I had let my husband believe I was busy with book clubs and tennis at the Glencoe. For 6 months into our marriage, he had been charming. Attentive. Curious about my opinions. Then his father's firm almost went under, and without ever telling him, I had quietly bought up his father's distressed debt and sold it back at a loss on paper but at a long-term gain in invisible leverage. Dean's family business survived. Dean never knew how. Something in him changed after that. I think, on some level, he sensed that he had been saved. And some wounded masculine instinct decided that the person who had saved him must be diminished, permanently, to keep the balance. He became mocking. Then dismissive. Then cruel in small, domestic ways that never left bruises but left scar tissue I could feel every time I tried to speak. I had stayed. I had stayed because I was building something. And because a divorce in the middle of my 3rd fund would have cost my investors 12 figures. And because my children were small and needed stability. And because, in the deepest chamber of my heart, I had wanted him to see me. I had wanted him to wake up one morning and notice his wife was a giant and feel the shame of having underestimated her. And love me for it. He never did. He wasn't going to. Tonight was the night I stopped waiting. I reapplied my lipstick. Rogue Noir. A color I had bought at Holt Renfrew the afternoon I signed the papers to acquire Dean's largest competitor. I had worn it on every major contract signing since. Tonight, it felt like armor. When I walked back into the ballroom, Dean was standing on his chair. He wasn't actually standing on it, but he may as well have been. He had gathered a wider audience now. 3 tables had been pulled together and he was holding forth on what he called the natural order of things, the proper division of labor between men and women in the Alberta energy sector, his voice loud enough to reach the bar at the far end of the room. I saw a woman at the next table, a petroleum engineer I recognized from a CAP conference 3 years ago, physically turn her chair away. I sat back down beside him. He squeezed my knee without looking at me. There she is, he boomed. My better half. Tell the boys what we had for dinner last Tuesday, honey. She does this thing with lamb shanks and pomegranate molasses. It'll ruin every other dinner you'll ever eat. Patricia caught my eye again. This time I nodded. She reached for her phone. Under the table, I felt my own buzz. Harold was typing. So was David. The wheels had begun to turn, and they would not stop turning now. Dean, I said softly. He didn't hear me. He was describing his lamb shanks like they were his own achievement. Dean. He finally looked at me, his eyes a little bleary now, his mouth still half open in mid-story. What, babe? Harold just got a text. He turned a little gray. You might want to check your phone. Dean's brow furrowed. He chuckled, patted my hand. Honey, we don't do business at dinner. Let the men handle the men's work. Harold's phone rang. He answered it in a low voice, stepped away from the table, and did not come back. David's phone rang next. Then Patrick's. In the span of 4 minutes, 3 of the 7 men at our table had excused themselves and were huddled in the hallway outside the ballroom. Their voices sharp and low. Their faces pale. Dean frowned. He took out his own phone, finally. He saw the notifications. He saw the emails. He saw the name of my firm, Lakeshore Holdings, in the subject line of a legal notice from Meridian's counsel, and his face drained of color in real time, inch by inch, the way snow recedes from a south-facing slope in April. What the hell is this? He muttered. What the hell? This can't be right. He stood up too quickly. His chair toppled behind him. A waiter steadied it. Dean stumbled out into the hallway to join the other men, already yelling into his phone. I sat alone at the table, the string quartet playing something by Debussy now, the mountains outside, holding their eternal blue silence. Patricia slid into Harold's empty chair beside me. She reached over and squeezed my hand. How do you feel? She whispered. I watched my husband through the glass doors, gesticulating wildly at Harold, who was shaking his head with a calm that bordered on pity. I feel free, I told her. And I meant it. That was at 9:47 p.m. By 10:01, Dean Whitlock had lost every major contract his brokerage held. By 10:15, the consortium had issued a formal statement to the effect that all midstream service agreements with Whitlock Energy Partners had been terminated effective immediately due to a breach of fiduciary covenant, language which, in the polite code of the Calgary energy sector, meant that Dean had done something so publicly embarrassing that Harold and David had no choice but to cut him loose without even letting him finish his whiskey. But none of that mattered yet. The press release was still embargoed. The markets were closed. The real storm was coming at 9 a.m. Tomorrow, when the Toronto Stock Exchange opened and my husband's publicly traded holding company would lose, by our actuary's conservative estimate, 78% of its market capitalization before lunch. I let Dean drive home to Mount Royal that night. He was too drunk to drive, but I let him anyway, because I wanted to sit in the passenger seat and watch the mountains disappear behind us, and because I needed the space to think. He didn't notice that I didn't offer to drive. He was too busy on his phone, leaving voicemail after voicemail for Harold, for David, for every board member whose direct line he had ever memorized, and none of them were picking up. What's happening? He kept muttering. What's happening? What's happening? Margaret, he said once, glancing at me as we turned onto 16th Avenue, do you know anything about this? Did you hear something at dinner? I looked out the window at the Calgary Tower, lit up in yellow and red for some civic occasion I couldn't remember. I shrugged. I'm just your wife, Dean. What would I know? He grunted and went back to his phone. We got home at 11:15. The house on Hillcrest Avenue, 4,000 square feet of sandstone and leaded glass that Dean believed he had paid for with his own money and that had, in truth, been purchased with the dividends from my second fund, sat quietly under the clear prairie stars. Dean stumbled up the stairs, muttering about lawsuits. I made myself a cup of Earl Grey and sat in the breakfast nook and watched the sky. At 1 in the morning, my phone rang. Harold. Margaret. His voice was tight with apology and adrenaline. I want you to know, we all feel terrible about how this is going to unfold tomorrow. But the board voted unanimously. Your package is cleaner. The numbers are undeniable. Harold, I said gently, you don't need to apologize. I built this for 20 years precisely so that nobody would ever need to apologize for making the right business decision. He paused. Then he laughed, softly. Linda says you're a national treasure. Tell Linda I'm taking her for brunch at the Fairmont on Sunday. I'll tell her. Get some sleep, Margaret. I didn't sleep. I worked through the night at my kitchen table, reviewing the press materials, making sure every line of the statement was clean, careful, and factual. Martinez, I kept typing, and then correcting. Not Martinez, Lakeshore. I had built my firm in the Canadian tradition, quietly, without fanfare, named for a lake my grandmother had loved in northern Ontario where she had spent every summer of her childhood. Lakeshore Holdings, chaired by Margaret Ellen Kilgore, formerly Margaret Ellen Whitlock, a name I had already begun, in small private ways, to unstitch from the name of the man upstairs sleeping off his whiskey in our king-sized bed. At 6 in the morning I changed into a charcoal Smythe suit I had bought in Toronto the previous fall. At 6:45, I drove my own car downtown, parked in my reserved spot on the second level of the Bankers Hall garage, and took the elevator to the 43rd floor. My chief of staff, Nadia, was already there, along with our head of legal, our communications director, and 3 of the board members who had driven in from Edmonton overnight. We ran through the press release one final time. At 8:57, my communications director pressed send on the embargoed distribution list. At 9 a.m., sharp, the TSX opened and every major business publication in the country ran the same headline within 60 seconds of each other. The Globe and Mail led with, Lakeshore Chair Margaret Kilgore emerges from anonymity, acquires husband's contract portfolio in overnight restructuring. The Financial Post was less generous to Dean. Calgary energy broker Whitlock loses entire client base as wife revealed as consortium head. BNN Bloomberg cut away from their morning segment and put my photograph on the lower third of the screen for 23 consecutive minutes. My phone rang at 9:03. Dean. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. I wanted him to feel every second. Margaret. His voice was hollow, like a room that had been emptied of furniture overnight. Margaret, what is happening? Turn on CBC. There's a woman on the news, and they're saying she's. Margaret, is this a joke? Please tell me this is a joke. Dean, I said, and my voice was steady. I need you to sit down. Is Claudia there? Claudia was our housekeeper, who had worked for us for 11 years and who, unbeknownst to Dean, had been quietly on my personal payroll the entire time because she deserved better than what he paid her. Yes, she's. Margaret, what is happening? I'm going to need you to listen to me very carefully. The company you built, Whitlock Energy Partners, no longer has any operating contracts. That is not going to change. The consortium voted unanimously last night. Your lawyers are going to tell you that you have grounds to sue. They are going to be wrong. Every contract had a clean termination clause and every termination was executed within those clauses. Your firm will file for creditor protection by end of business today. There was a sound on the other end like a man being punched in the sternum. Margaret. His voice cracked. Margaret. We've been married for 20 years. Yes. Is this you? Are you doing this? I am, Dean. Me. Just me. Just your wife. The silence that followed was the longest of our marriage. You. His voice was barely audible. You're the chair. I am. Since when? Since before you met me, in a sense. I founded it at 23. I incorporated under my grandmother's name. You never asked. In 20 years, Dean, you never once asked me what I actually did with my days. You assumed. I let you. I heard him breathe. I heard, in the background, Claudia's voice saying something soft and steady to him. For a moment I felt a hot pulse of something I had not expected to feel, something close to pity. At dinner, he whispered. All those things I said. I know. Harold knew. Harold has been on my board for 8 years. Patricia. My mentor since 2004. A long, ragged breath. Then, very quietly. Why did you stay, Margaret? And this, I realized, was the question the whole marriage had been waiting for him to ask. Not the question of what I did. Not the question of who I was. But the question of why, for all those years, I had allowed him to diminish me in public and in private, when I so clearly had the power to leave at any moment. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. Because I loved you once, I said finally. Because we had 2 beautiful children and I wanted them to grow up with their father. Because I kept believing you'd wake up one day and see me. And because, Dean, some part of me wanted to know how bad it would have to get before you did. Last night, in that ballroom, you gave me my answer. You would never have seen me. Not in 10 more years. Not in 30. He was crying now. I could hear it. I felt, for the first time in a decade, absolutely still inside. The storm I had carried in my chest since our 8th anniversary had finally, mercifully, gone quiet. Margaret, he said. Margaret, please. We can fix this. No, Dean. We can't. But I will tell you what happens next. I have filed for divorce this morning. My counsel will contact yours within the hour. The terms are generous, more generous than you deserve, because I will not have our children reading in the Herald that their mother stripped their father bare. You will keep the Canmore house. You will receive a one-time settlement sufficient to live comfortably for the rest of your life, provided you live quietly. In return, you will sign a non-disparagement clause. You will never speak about me or about Lakeshore to any media outlet. You will accept that our marriage ended last night at the Banff Springs Hotel and that it ended because of your choices, not mine. I paused. And Dean. Yes. The next time you are tempted to introduce a woman as just a wife, I want you to remember the sound of your own voice on the phone right now. I hung up. I sat in my office on the 43rd floor, the Bow River glittering below me, the Rockies white and enormous on the western horizon, and I put my face in my hands. Not out of sadness, exactly. Out of something older. The sensation a long-distance runner feels when she finally crosses a finish line she has been racing toward, quietly, for half her life. Nadia brought me a coffee. She stood beside me and did not say anything for a long time. Finally, she said, "There's a reporter from Maclean's who would like to speak with you. And one from the Walrus. And your daughter Emma called from Montreal. She said she's on her way to the airport." I wiped my eyes with the back of my wrist. "Tell Maclean's I'll speak with them at 2 o'clock, I said. "Tell the Walrus I'll think about it. And tell Emma her mother is fine. Tell her I'm more than fine. Tell her I'm finally the woman she should have always known me to be." 8 months later, I sat on a panel at the University of Calgary's Haskayne School of Business, alongside 3 other Canadian women who had quietly, over decades, built some of the largest private fortunes in the country without ever making a single magazine cover. The moderator asked us, at the end of the session, what advice we would give to young women starting out in industries that would try to dismiss them. The other 3 women gave thoughtful, measured answers about mentorship, about finding the right seat at the right table, about the importance of financial literacy and of asking for what you are worth. When the microphone came to me, I thought for a long moment. I thought of Dean, who was living now in a condo in Canmore and who, according to our children, had begun attending weekly counseling and seemed, slowly, to be becoming a man none of us had known he could be. I thought of my grandmother, who had kept the books for 3 refineries and died without ever having her name on the door. I thought of the ballroom at the Banff Springs Hotel, and of the moment Harold Chang had looked at me across the orchids and I had known that this night, at long last, would be the night. I leaned into the microphone. "Never announce yourself," I said. "The loudest men in any room are almost always the least powerful ones. The real power in this country has always been held quietly, patiently, by people who were dismissed as just a wife, just a secretary, just a nurse. Just a farmer's daughter from somewhere nobody important has ever heard of. Do not waste your energy trying to be seen. Build something so real, so undeniable, so rooted in your own bones, That when the day finally comes that you do decide to be seen, the ground itself will shift under the feet of the people who told you that you couldn't. A young woman in the third row stood up and began clapping, and within seconds the entire auditorium was on its feet. I thought, just for a moment, of my husband, 20 years ago, laughing gently across a table at Il Sogno, telling me that my dreams would feel a lot smaller once I met the right guy. He had been so wrong. My dreams, it turned out, had only ever been waiting for me to stop hiding them inside his.